This story tells the story of the German soldier on the Eastern Front during World War II. It covers the German army's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the German army's struggles against the Soviet Union's vast military forces, Russian winters in living memory. Zhukov's counterstrike in the midst of this winter in front of Moscow may have been primitive in delivery, but brought the austere to its knees. General Winter did not defeat Hitler. It was rather the dogged ferocity of the Russian soldier. German fighting power had already been degraded by losses in the summer encirclement battles. Although the austere had inflicted 3 to 4 million casualties on the Russians before Moscow, it had lost the equivalent of 30 divisions itself. This was greater than the Northern Army group that had launched toward Leningrad, at 26 divisions strong. The dead included the cream of the veteran German leadership, more than 1/3 of its young officers and NCOs. These men were the core of German Alfred's tactic or mission control expertise, able to operate fluidly and with great initiative. Their loss, alongside 50% of the panzer and motorized vehicles, was irreplaceable. Willpower hemorrhaged from the force as it became less mobile and able to think, close quote, and react decisively tactically. In essence, the German army in the East victored itself to death. Hitler took over in the midst of the 1941 winter crisis, and his hold-in-place and D-order ushered in a period of inflexible and dogmatic leadership. Lucas's writing about German army viewpoints of the Red Army, garnered through bitter experience, attracted the attention of NATO observers seeking to assess the Soviet army during the Cold War years in Europe. The stoicism of Red Army soldiers was juxtaposed against the poor leadership and lack of initiative displayed by its officers. The innate cunning and excellent individual field craft of Russian soldiers was recognized. Wild human wave attacks, and now reports from cities of enraging ruthless tanks and cannon on its bound routes, seemingly inhuman powers of resistance, could suddenly result in illogical herd mentality instances of mass surrender. The Red Army soldier was an enigma. Lessons were drawn by the modern NATO armies for combating mass Soviet tanks at close quarters. Interest was also shown in the German army's response to dealing with the practical problems of winter warfare in sub-zero conditions. Wehrmacht training publications were translated and incorporated into NATO winter survival handbooks. Lucas describes the sheer immensity and intensity of the titanic battles on the Russian front. Huge encirclement battles at Kiev and Vasma netted 665 and 665 VATs in a significantly short space, 41 minutes, 90 seconds, and 16:44. 0 Russian prisoners respectively, as well as hundreds of tanks and thousands of guns. The Russians were to learn and apply these lessons and turn them against their teachers. Defeat for the austere came after the encirclement of a complete army group in Group Center in the summer of 1944. This broke the back of the German army in the East and was the precursor to the Soviet attack on Berlin by April 1945. Lucas has vividly presented the listener with the simple German soldier's view of these epic events by narrating a series of small unit actions set amid the titanic battles on the Eastern Front. Robert Kershaw, 2014, Introduction and Acknowledgements. The imposing vastness of the space in which our troops are now assembling cannot fail to strike a deep impression. The Chief of the General Staff, June 1941, at 3:30 hours on the dawn of Sunday the 22nd of June 1941, 7 German infantry armies, their advance spearheaded by 4 panzer groups, attacked the Soviet Union and opened thereby the greatest struggle in the history of military operations. A commander, when planning a campaign, must have always in mind certain factors which will determine its successful outcome. Chief among these are the limitations of time and space, the strength of his own army as well as that of the enemy, and the considerations of terrain and climate. The war, which the German army undertook against the Soviet Union, was the struggle of titans. A war of superlatives, both for the area it covered and for the numbers involved. The frontier, at the opening of hostilities, was nearly 1,600 kilometers long, excluding the 100-kilometer-long border between Finland and Russia. Then, as the German army moved eastwards, entered Russia proper, the front expanded like a fan, so that the battle line eventually reached from northern Finland to the Caucasus, a distance of nearly 300 kilometers. The depth of the fighting area was 960 kilometers. Within these vast areas of longitude and latitude, there marched and maneuvered the German army on its way, or so it thought, to a new, short, and victorious war. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 3,580 panzers and 784 guns, covered by a Luftwaffe umbrella of 1830 aircraft, rolled across the frontier. In the first offensives, propaganda had led the world to believe that the German army was a vast mechanized or motorized force. But this belief was false. Pulling the guns and the carts of the supply columns, or working as pack animals, was nearly 750,000 horses, more than had entered the Kaiser's War in 1914. The imposing half-tracked troop carriers were few in number, and the German infantry foot-marched vast distances, often covering 70 kilometers per day, for periods of several weeks together. The army, which contested the German invasion, was the Red Army of workers and peasants, an unknown factor. An army which Hitler had dismissed as being a clay colossus without a head. It was known to be mighty in numbers, with a huge field force backed by a vast reservoir of reservists. It was thought to be poorly commanded and badly armed, but unknown to the RKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces planners, was the fact that the Russian host was equipped with some weapons, particularly tanks, which were qualitatively superior to those on issue to their own divisions. These shocks were yet become. The country into which the armies were advancing was a vast landmass, made up of every type of terrain from the pine-forested emptiness of northern Finland. The line ran through the wide expanses of Russia's western border zone. Much of that region was covered by almost impenetrable swamps, the greatest of which extended for a distance equivalent to that between London and Carlisle south of this, and crossing the wide and monotonous steppes of the Ukraine, the land changed and was succeeded in the extreme southern part of the battlefront by the subtropical climate and terrain of Georgia. The Caucasus, across whole regions of the line from Finland to the Caucasus, were great forests of such density that they were almost jungle. The presence of the natural obstacles of mountain, desert, marsh and jungle forced the German armies into predictable routes of advance, and it was to break through these passages, defended by the Red Army, that many of the bloodiest battles were fought. The appreciation of terrain, which von Greifenberg, at one time Chief of Staff of the 12th Army, wrote, can be applied to regions other than the one about which he was reporting east of the Buksan line, in Poland. He wrote, "Terrain conditions and the shortage of roads restrict movement. The rivers often overflow and cause widespread flooding. This disadvantage becomes more pronounced to the farther east one penetrates, particularly in the marshy, heavily forested regions of the Pripyat marshes and the Beresina River. The terrain was usually bad, the river obstacles were wide, the roads few in number and poor in construction, and the main railway lines could be counted on the fingers of one hand. The German army, which was armed for and had prepared for a short and tactical war, was expected to use the equipment designed for operations in Western Europe in all the types of terrain which were contained. Within the Soviet Union, 3 of the 4 military considerations had been considered. Only that of climate needed to be added to the calculation, and this factor OKW was confident could be disregarded, for it was planned to finish the war with Russia before the onset of bad weather. All things considered, there seemed to have been no impediments which might cause Hitler to shrink back from that decision, which Joseph Goebbels was to declare had caused the whole world to hold its breath at dawn on the day following Midsummer Day, and preceding that day on which Napoleon had invaded Russia. The guns spoke, and their voice was to remain unstilled for 46 months of battle, during which tens of millions were to die. The greatest war in recorded history had begun. This book sets out to describe only certain features of the Russo-German War, of 194-11945, those as seen by the Germans and their allies. It is not a history of that war, neither is it a chronology of its battles, nor a potted description of the progress of the campaigns. Rather, it is a random selection of experiences and shock events which serve to illustrate the peculiarities of life on the Russian front. It is a compilation of experiences which were unique to war on that front, of conditions which were first encountered there, or which impressed their own stamp upon the fighting there.